Good day, my fellow classmates and Professor Rumney. My name is Marisol Prieto. The following is a presentation on the book that I read To Each His Own by Sicilian author Leonardo Sciascia. We now come to the image of the book that I read To Each His Own. What I actually found interesting was that this detective novel was originally published in Italian in 1966 and later on published in English in 1992, which then became available to English readers such as myself. To Each His Own explores what the mafia mentality was like during the 1950s and 60s, and also the Sicilian culture during that time. I will now take you into the author and a little bit about his background. Leonardo Sciascia was born in the early 1920s in a small city called Racamulto in Italy. Starting in the 1950s, he established himself as a novelist, essayist, and occasionally served as a controversial commentator on political affairs. Sciascia's publications are dominated by Sicilian life, and more specifically how intertwined the mafia is into Sicilian society. In fact, he used storytelling as an instrument for investigating and attacking the spirit of the mafia and its saturated culture of Sicily. Sciascia was described as a conscience of Italy by his fellow Sicilians for not being afraid to write about the moral and ethical issues of his time. To Each His Own was birthed out of the corruption in Italian society. I will then now take you into this plot of the story. The story begins with Dr. Motto, the town's pharmacist, who receives an anonymous letter made from words cut out of a newspaper, which include the letterhead Unicri, written at the top, warning him of retribution for an unknown reason that frightens him and his hunting companion, Dr. Rocio. This death threat is then dismissed by the local townspeople as a practical joke, but sad to say that the next day, as the pharmacist and Dr. Rocio plan a trip to go hunting, things don't turn out as expected and they both get murdered on the scene. This letter then becomes apparent that it was intended to do way much more than just frighten the two unsuspecting victims. As rumors start to flow around, many of the local townspeople begin to sense the real reason for this double homicide. And there's one character in particular in the story. His name is Professor Lorana, whose naive and rational sense of nature propel him to pursue the investigation after finding a clue that the police has missed. Professor Lorana then discovers whoever made this anonymous letter used the same newspaper cuttings from the Vatican publication, the Osservatore Romano, which is distinctive motto, Unicri, which means to each his own, written on the masthead of this newspaper. Lorana then follows up with this by trying to find the publications that were published from specific dates to see if this would tie into the murders. To his knowledge, this leads him to a dead end, and things are then steered into a different direction. For months, Lorana then follows various leads, and before long finds himself entangled in a web of corruption from which he cannot escape. I will now take you into the detective hero. As I read this story, Professor Lorana was not just the typical guy who gave up and called it quits. After coming to a dead end with a newspaper lead, he was still determined to try and solve the mysterious murder of his good friend, Dr. Rocio. In my perspective, as we previously read on Detective Heroes, I analyzed closely that Professor Lorana could easily be characterized as an amateur detective, given his traits of being honest, meticulous, not intelligent, and indeed at times positively obtuse. But this didn't stop him from stepping out of his own profession to be a detective or a hero in the story. Along with his informal investigations, Lorana fatally lacked the elastic, insistent, homeopathic skepticism that is rooted so deeply and invisibly into the social culture of the 1950s and 60s. Lorana's character is relative to the movie Mr. and Mrs. North, The Silent Butler, and more specifically compared to the character of Mrs. North as she becomes the focal point of the story, and is also not taken seriously for her detective work just as Lorana was. I will now take you into the very interesting part of the book, Who Done It. We take a look at Mrs. Rocio, which was the late wife of Dr. Rocio. There were speculations concerning the beautiful widow of Dr. Rocio. After the funerals were over, having settled on a reason for the murders, the townspeople turned their focus to the future of Dr. Rocio's voluptuous widow. The amorous adventures of the widow occupy the minds of the townspeople, and these assumptions are what placed her as a first suspect. We now take a look at Rosello, the lawyer, who is another suspect to which had multiple political partnerships and was very wealthy and also obtained many different positions. Rosello never favored one government party over the other. He aligned himself for personal, political, and financial gain. Mr. Rosello was also one of the victim's cousins, which is a viable reason to make him the second suspect. Last but not least, finally we have Regana, who was an acquaintance of Rosello and was also a respectable, unpunished, and untouchable criminal that Professor Lorana came across, who coincidentally smoked the same Bronca cigars that were found at the scene of the crime, which undoubtedly made him the third suspect. We now come to a conclusion. To each his own is a very different sort of novel. It is ultimately becomes clear in its resolution, and it's perfectly pulled off by the author, Shusha. With cruel casualness suggesting that society is thoroughly corrupted by money, politics being the most dominant power, and lies and secrecy. This novel met the characteristics of the 5 elements that were discussed in week 2, which was involving a crime, a detective, a suspect, misleading clues, and a solution. I was able to analyze the detective hero, which I concluded was an amateur detective. This detective story also fell into some of the rule guidelines that were introduced by Van Dynes and Raymond Chandler. I hope you have enjoyed this presentation, and I look forward to your reviews and critiques.